Hello everyone, thank you for coming out, I really appreciate you. Welcome to Design at Record-Breaking Scale. My name is Nikawai Jin, I'm Senior Designer at that game company, and this is going to be a presentation about how we designed an hour-long emotional musical experience for 10,000 players in a game designed just for 8. A little bit about myself so you know who you're hearing from. I did play a key role in concepting, designing, and implementing this project, so it really means a lot to me. I've also spent a lot of time contemplating what design means at this scale, because prior to game development, I was actually in architecture and I studied urbanism, and in those fields, we create spaces for people, which there happen to be more than 8 of. So, the behavior of any single person is extremely difficult to predict over time. The behavior of 5 or 10 people, you can forget about that. 20 is even worse still. But after a certain population, the actions of each individual dissolve away into the shared trajectory of everyone else's, which, as it turns out, may be far less complicated to project, and if we're courageous enough, dare I say, even design for. This is the premise behind Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy, not Aurora's musical voyage, but it does reflect what we experienced designing and developing it. It groups not 2 or 8 or even 800 or even 8,000 players, but 10,000 co-located human beings in an interactive virtual space as one big, supermassive group. Let's take a step back and talk about Sky first. Sky itself is a social MMO where you can hold hands, hug, fly, and otherwise explore the history of a once great kingdom as a total of up to 8 players. This is what Sky is normally, a social, awe-inspiring experience all about sharing intimate moments with small groups of close friends. This is part of our long studio heritage here at that game company of creating emotional games that connect people, especially by exploring our shared humanity. Now, Aurora herself is a talented and award-winning Norwegian musician. Aurora has a lot of hits on her hands, and many people don't know this, but she actually sang the credits for Sky already. So there was a pre-existing relationship between the two of us. The Aurora concert is a fusion of Aurora and Sky at a much bigger scale. It explores what it feels like to be connected to thousands of people. I'm going to share a little highlight reel to help you understand what that actually was. And keep in mind that as we watch this, all of the creatures you see, all the jellyfish, the birds, the mantas, etc., these are all real people playing alongside each other in real time. And 2, we're going to go over these concepts. Then at the very end, we're going to grab some takeout, and I'm going to treat you all to a little bit of dessert. And importantly, along the way, there are going to be countless analogies, mainly because it helps me understand things when I analogize it to something else. And our guides will be these friendly folks. I made these. These are personifications of all of those concepts we saw earlier because it's fun, and also because I think it helps with when a concept is physicalized somehow. So let's meet this group. This is Scale. Everyone say hello, Scale. Hello, Scale. Scale wants us to know that it is impossible to conceptualize scale and that we need to remember how special every individual is. Okay, let's try to conceptualize things at this scale. 10,000 is big. It's really, really big. In fact, I think it's so uniquely big that we need a new term to help us talk about it: supermassive group. For context, Sky is designed for 8 people, or to say it differently, accommodates 0.08% of our intended player count. This is a clip from Powers of 10, a 1977 short documentary by Charles and Ray Eames, all about scale. So you can see the difference between what scale means at 1 meter for 1 person, all the way up to 10,000 meters for 10,000 people. Of course, if you're going by square meters, you would have stopped earlier. But the fact still stands, that is enormously large. And that was the first lesson that we learned, was that it is simply impossible to properly and consistently conceptualize the size of such a group. It's just so big. Our mental number lines bias towards smaller numbers, and Dunbar's number, which is the theoretical upper limit for how many people humans can maintain in their social networks at any given time, is just 150. We want to obliterate far, 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 far past it. So I will be defining supermassive group with absolutely no authority to mean a group of concurrently active and co-located real-time networked players in groups of 1,000 or more. But in our case, we're talking 10 times that, 10,000. All the while, somehow, we have to still ensure that the humanity of each participant shines through. Because what's the point of being around 9,999 other individuals if you don't feel their humanity next to you? These are seemingly contradictory design goals. Explore scale, but every single individual person is special. It hasn't really been explored in media. There was one example, however, that I found, which is Alan McCullum's Over 10,000 Individual Work series, which does precisely this. Takes 10,000 unique individual objects and places them next to each other, places them in context of each other, and because of that, the whole that they create is made all the more special. So we want to do this, but interactive and to music with real people on mobile for an hour. This has never been done before, so we have to chart our own path here. So thank you very much, Scale, for making us feel really good about ourselves, but for teaching us the important lesson that it is impossible to conceptualize things that are this big, and reminding us that we need to make sure every individual is special. But let's say we've done this. How can we start organizing things? How do we start, planning our design? Well, our good friend Structure, who ought to be in all of our projects. Structure insists that there needs to be a narrative spine, or we're going to have anarchy, and that spine should be about the group's groupness. What do we mean by this? Well, one of the earliest and perhaps most intuitive lessons we learned was that the more actors you introduce in a system, the noisier it all gets. So we need to make sure we have a really strong spine that establishes order and meaning, so that even among all of that noise, it's still a clear, cohesive experience. So for us, that was creating a grand story arc for the entire experience defined by emotional highs and lows. We developed a narrative about humanity and nature, and yes, these are the actual design documents. They're very artistically beautiful and the great designer kind of way. It explored the different emotional stages of being and not being in community with others. It explored contrasting social themes like selfishness and selflessness, togetherness, and isolation. We told each of these stories through each song as the concert unfolded, with each song containing within it its own story in its own landscape. Selecting stories about group sizes and the emotional aspects of being in a community helps ensure that at the highest level, the fundamental type of experience that players are looking to have is thematically compatible with the type of experience you are looking to create as a developer. That seems like kind of obvious, but it can be easy to overlook this. So we developed another similarly large-scale project later, Season of Passage, that I think failed to deliver the same emotional impact as the concert due to a number of reasons, but one of which was a misalignment at this scale. For Season of Passage, we were focusing on big group gameplay activities, and so that's what we invested all of our time into. But unfortunately, what we weren't able to do was resolve a narrative that also had to do with community. So that ultimately, unfortunately, got cut from the story before it shipped, even though that was a part of our earliest concepts all along. So Season of Passage wound up being you playing gameplay activities with lots and lots of other people and then having an intimate story with just a handful of NPCs. That made things a little confusing and inconsistent for players, you know? It's like, why are you even here? I've been talking with these NPCs and then now I'm doing something with 100 other people. It doesn't really make sense. There was a lot that went into Season of Passage, but this particular narrative and structural point is one that I feel we thankfully managed to avoid with the Aurora concert, because the story itself was all about being in a group. It was about being in a community. So thank you, structure. Now we know we need a narrative spine and that it should be about the group's groupness. But what about design guidelines? We're designers anyway. First and foremost, our friend Simplicity is here to remind us that our technical constraints will always be our design constraints, whether or not we're designing at this scale, but importantly that at this scale, the group itself will fill in the silence created by those very technical constraints. So, where we've been in like concept diagrammy land for so long, now we need to make it a reality. So technically speaking, like how do we even support 10,000 players? What does that mean? How does that work on the game? Ultimately, what we arrived at was a solution that gave us, the designers, the positional data for each player, and in order to render all 10,000 at the screen at the same time, we would render each of these individual avatars as kind of a more simplified geometry. In this case, we're looking at a torture test of all kinds of abstracted Sky kids, which are the characters that we colloquially call in Sky. But they didn't just have to be abstracted humanoid shapes. Very quickly we learned that maybe they could be birds or jellyfish, mantas, butterflies, and we used all of these for the concert. These simplified models worked well given our technical constraints. But that was pretty much it, the position of that bird, knowing that that bird is a player, and the bird could emote. And that was pretty much all we had to work with for a really long time. But that began to define the central design principle for this chapter of the talk, which is simplicity. Let me share an example of what I mean. So I had a lot of early self-conscious attempts to supposedly enrich the experience with more stuff. So this is one of my test levels. Because it's hard to fathom, as we've established, this many players in the same place at the same time, I often over-designed the experience because I was trying to preemptively fill in the gaps created by the narrow technical limitations that we knew we would get. I thought, if all I have is positions and that's it, I really need to crank up everything else. So this was an early iteration I got really stuck on. I thought, well, for the song to be interesting, the narrative content of the song that I mentioned earlier needed to unfold in some mechanical kind of way, So in this version, Aurora, which is represented as this flare, kind of moves throughout the environment and then distributes these blue orbs that pulse with the music, and then the player approaches those orbs, and then they start orbiting around them, and then that reveals a little vignette that tells a story. And in this case, they're just big blocks, which you'll see in a little bit. But that's what I was trying to do, approaching what I thought was a design problem with some mechanical solutions. But we would play test this, and when we would do so with more players, we would realize that The sense of complexity was too high, it was disorienting, and we'd get the same feedback when we had more people. So more people meant cutting back more stuff, and this happened repeatedly until I started to realize that this is the show, that the player is the show, and all of that other stuff that I was working on is actually just in support of this. So keeping the design simple and not trying to compete with all 10,000 players that are going to be on the screen helps this humanity shine through, because ultimately that's the best part of being around so many people. So thank you, Simplicity, for communicating that technical constraints are also design constraints and reassuring us that, or reassuring me rather, because I had a personal relationship with Simplicity throughout the development of this, that the group will fill in the silence. I have faith in that now. That also relates to the next design principle, which is spectacle, aka the player is the show. Yeah, the player is the show. I can't reiterate this enough. This is such a big aspect of the design that took me a long time to realize. And importantly, that the individual capabilities will determine the group's overall organization. So why is it that we're willing to spend money and get dressed up and travel out to places like San Francisco to experience concerts, conventions, or game development conferences, shoulder to shoulder with so many strangers, when we could arguably have a comparable experience simply watching a video of the event online? I'm sure many of you are doing that right now, and in the future. Hello from the past. Aside from all the financial, physical, and temporal accessibility concerns, which are often the reasons why I, at least, choose not to go to these places, I think a huge factor in my motivation, and in the motivation of most people, is the desire to be part of a collective, shared experience, to be next to each other, socialize with like-minded individuals, feel inspired and connected, and of course, relish in the company that we've made all the more beautiful. This is what we felt with each increasingly large playtest. You know, the beauty was in the group, and importantly, being in the group and contributing to it as a participant. Of course, it didn't take long for us to start talking about animals and how they get into groups, because we always design from somewhere. And when animals come together, the form and the organization that their groups take are determined by the capabilities of each of those individuals. So a crab is capable of some things, and a horse is capable of entirely different things. And because they're also in two different environments, when you bring a bunch of them together, they start operating differently. And the thrill, of course, is being in this group while it's happening, you know, being in a stampede of horses. Yeah, we are all animals, of course, and the experience of being the bottommost crab in the pile in that organization and the innermost sheep in the flock in that organization are both vastly different in structure and presumably enjoyability, but I could be wrong. I'm not a crab yet. We still have time, so you never know. But the spectacle is the show, and the group is the show, and the group will behave differently depending on the capabilities of each of the individuals. So to succeed in making the player the show, to succeed in organizing the group in a compelling way, we can tune each individual's capabilities. So thank you, spectacle, but what does that even mean to tune those capabilities? How do we move away from that crab pile and move towards something that is much more compelling? Well, we can talk to our other friend, Affordance, who's so cute. Affordance is going to tell us all about parrot problems, which are a thing, how guiding the individual can make a structured group, and importantly, the necessity to leave freedom for expression. Before we leave this animal analogy, I just want to share that I currently live in Long Beach, and in Long Beach, we have these feral parrots that fly all over town. A lot of places in Southern California have this, and they are so loud. It's remarkable how loud one parrot can be, but when they're in their flock, you basically can't hear anything else. And we had a lot of parrot problems in Sky. So let me explain this picture. This picture is from an early playtest. Do you know what this picture is? This picture is a pile of crabs. This is what this is. And we do not want this. What we want is organization. Because if you don't have organization, it's distracting, there's a lot of noise, Makes it difficult to concentrate. There's no visual hierarchy to what's happening. And when was the last time you saw like a herd of horses or a flock of birds completely not acknowledge each other or their prevailing path of travel? You know, if even 10% of our players are doing this, that's like 1,000 clumsy cicadas or June bugs just like bouncing off the walls. We don't want that. So we tried to find a good way to enable each individual to move throughout the space. This is footage from an early version of the song Warrior. And the control scheme here was autopilot. This was very short-lived, as you could expect, but I needed to get it out of my system. You strap in, much like you do a roller coaster, you buckle up, and then that's pretty much it. You can maybe look around, but your movement is determined for you by the game. Now, that's no fun, and this wouldn't have been compelling with 10,000 players, so we quickly moved past this. Okay, so maybe we can do something in between, right? So if not everyone's totally strapped in, maybe we can allow each of these individuals to freely deviate if they want, but if they didn't want to or didn't know how, as we were expecting a lot of new people to play the concert, that it would still carry them out throughout all of the environments that we had created. How is this possible? Well, we have this guide rail system in Sky, which allows us as designers to define the extents and direction of travel that we would like players to move in. You can actually see that in the wireframe here. We have these big green extents, and then we have this curve that you might be able to see that is the direction. One of our great engineers, Maxwell Zietz, improved this and created kind of like a laminar flow version of this, which allows the individual to move, or to be guided rather, along the tangent to the curvature here, regardless of whether or not they're closer to the center or further out to the sides. The best way I can describe this is being in like a lazy river. So it's kind of difficult to push back against the current in such a river, but I could get inside with a bunch of my friends at the same time and experience this journey together while still having some freedom to kind of go this way and that. So this is a video of the updated version of Warrior that was created by one of the most talented designers I've ever known, Travis Stringer. So, I mean, I think this looks way better. The guide rail system that we mentioned earlier helped literally and figuratively align everyone and gave a strong sense of community and intention, and it ensured that there was a legible trajectory to the entire experience. Remember that each manta here is a real person somewhere in the world, and I think you can really feel that a lot more when everybody's moving together. Importantly, for us as designers, we could know where players would be, roughly when they would be there, and that way we could set up shots like this, which I think is one of the best shots from the concert. But also, sometimes we didn't want players to be kind of guided on these rails. Sometimes we wanted the player to be able to maneuver freely throughout the space. Why would we want this? Well, if you've been guided for so long and then all of a sudden you're not guided anymore, you might feel uneasy. This place might feel mysterious. And that's what we were trying to achieve with All the Soft inside this song here. But if they're not on the rail, then people start bonking into objects and getting stuck in geometry. A lot of people don't even know how to use a camera, so they miss out on entire portions of the song. That's stressful and pretty ungraceful. And the last thing we want is for you to be embarrassed or self-conscious in front of 9,999 other people. That is a literal nightmare. So, another simple solution here was to create a general collision prevention system for the flight controller so that even if the player gave no input, as is the case here, they would avoid walls, stay above the ground, and it would prevent them from getting stuck in little nooks and crannies like this. We actually called this Soarin' Over California, funnily enough. And it works quite well. So with no input, this character is able to maneuver through a pretty complicated environment and never at any point really get caught anywhere. Graceful and stress-free. So both of these systems, I felt, worked together really well to create a unifying structure, the kind of structure we wanted, without tying each individual to a hyper-rigid possibility space. You add on top of that the ability to emote, and there's suddenly a lot of expression and a lot of life here. We start to get more and more of this starling murmuration experience, which has always been inspiring, and less of that crab pile one. precisely because of the affordances that we have put in and given to each individual. But of course, what our community came up with without any of our help was far, far more compelling. This was truthfully one of the most exciting things that we anticipated at the studio. Essentially, intrepid players, once this was live, began to organize flash mobs with each other. They started to kind of get smart about things. Love trains emerged early, where players would follow each other in a big long line and spam the heart emote. And that gave way to waterfalls, where players would jump from high places and spamming other emotes, trying to, here we go, that's a great example right there. And then, of course, there were light towers, where players would use each other to get as high as they possibly could, stretch that verticality as much as possible, kind of like, they're standing on each other's shoulders. There were also whirlpools, tracing, drawings, and even fully rehearsed animations. This is just absolutely incredible. And again, none of these activities were initially planned by us. We did later facilitate some for the encore, which happened a year later, but only in response to what the community showed us they were capable of doing and wanted to do. We truthfully have the best community ever. Like, if you play Sky, thank you so much, you're amazing. But all this emerged from the fusion of the affordances that we gave players and, of course, our incredible community. And these images in particular, I don't know if you can read, it says Aurora right there, which is awesome. These are images were taken from the positional data we received on the back end. So we could watch in real time while some of these were happening as well, which was incredible. Just goes to show when you give people even some amount of control and you put them all together, amazing things will happen. Being in one of these is like a total unreal experience. It's like the tallest elevator you've ever been in. It's amazing. Thank you, affordance. Starting to feel a little better. I know what problems are and how to get around it. I know that I need to guide individuals, but that will make a structured group, and that leaving room for freedom can be super fun. Everything's going to be great, right? No, who is this unsavory character? His name is Unfordance. Their name is Unfordance, which is a made-up word. It's a made-up word that I created to help describe the qualities of the supermassive group that make our lives as designers difficult as a whole. And interestingly, they also map to the states of matter: solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. I wish I had like an analogy counter on this. I feel like we're racking them up. So let's just start with solid. Why is the supermassive group a solid? Because it will obstruct. It will get in its own way in some contexts more than others. I'm sure we've all had this kind of experience. If you give people a singular point of interest, they will swarm to them, and that is unmanageable and unenjoyable. So, these are images from one of our pre-ship builds. Can you spot the player in either of these? Well, I couldn't either, so there's no highlight here. They're just somewhere in there. You have to take my word for it. So this would happen a lot. We tried a lot of different solutions to try to combat this, but one of the most helpful ones wound up being something we called ember regions. Wes Hawkins, another one of our fantastic engineers, helped to work on this system that allows designers like myself to hand-place regions in the world that take the abstracted player models, be they the abstracted, Sky Kid models, the jellyfish, mantas, etc., and when they enter into these regions, we reduce their visibility down to a but we just reduce it. This has a lot of advantages. It frees up a lot of real estate in a lot of hotspot areas while still communicating to you just how many real human beings there are next to you. We later learned to proceduralize these around things like NPCs and pickups, etc. So next up, the group is a liquid because it fills the shape of its container. Not very many people know this, but Bruce Lee was actually a game designer. And he was way ahead of his time. He had this famous quote, "Empty your mind, be formless, shapeless like a supermassive group of players." If you put a supermassive group into a cup, it becomes the cup. If you put it into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now a supermassive group can flow or it can crash. Be a supermassive group of players, my friend. Thank you, Bruce. We too learned that every valid point that is not out of bounds, and sometimes even those points, will be occupied by a player at any given point in time. Obviously, that makes it a real challenge to waterproof everything. And at first, this surprised me until I remembered how crows sit along power lines, with spaces in between them. They do this because they each have wings, and they need those wings to take off and to land, so they sit separated from each other. Likewise, we each have a natural bubble around all of us that drives us to expand elsewhere when we feel that that space has been encroached upon. And this even happens in virtual space. So if you don't want someone in your face, you move around a little bit. And then if you get in someone else's face, they'll move around a little bit. And if everybody does that, the group will disperse, even when there isn't any interplayer collision like this. Now, we also quickly learned not to spawn everybody in the same place, like in a one-unit area. This phenomena would help us, but we also quickly learned to distribute the spawns of everybody in a fairly large area. But this phenomenon helped me a lot because I was actually quite worried about this. Would your sightlines be constantly violated by other players? Turns out, we're not special. Really smart people like Edward T. Hall already explored interpersonal distance in a subdiscipline of anthropology called proxemics. This is where we get the term personal space from, and I believe what drives the supermassive group's shape-filling liquid reality. I think this is the natural phenomena behind all that. So what did we do as designers? Well, to accommodate this, we just designed enormous environments, bigger rails, bigger boundaries, especially when we have more players. It helped me, at least, to not understand the group like a mass of individuals, which I was doing at the start, but instead think of them like a deluge or a wave that spreads to fill the extent of every new play space. A fluid that occupies all the space you give it, very much like a game of Pipe Mania. And yes, it can feel as stressful sometimes to try managing such a group. All right, the group is a gas because it is compressible. Not only will it morph to fit the shape of its container, but it will expand or compress to fill that shape, be it larger or smaller. So let's look at this gas of jellyfish. If each one of these jellyfish is an individual gas particle, they're in this tiny cave, and the kind of jellyfish per unit volume is actually quite high in here. As we transition to this much larger cave right after this, we'll see that this group begins to depressurize. The gas begins to disperse. It doesn't happen immediately, but it does happen. Now, this can be an issue if we're just looking at it superficially speaking, for crowd control reasons. Oh my gosh, I have 5,000 players, 10,000 players, and I'm trying to get them through an area that's much smaller. This is going to be such a pain. It's going to be very difficult. But we can also use it to our advantage. So now, at this point, the kind of jellyfish per unit volume is much, much less. It's dispersed. So we're going to level up this analogy. We're going to talk about Boyle's law and Charles' law. Boyle's law states that at a constant temperature, volume increases as pressure decreases. This is pretty straightforward. You make less space for players, and they will start to feel more pressure. Fair enough. Charles' law states that as volume increases, temperature increases. So I'm stretching the analogy a little bit here, but I actually think if we understand temperature in this context to mean a kind of emotional sensitivity, I think it works quite well. If we make less space for players, we increase their sensitivity to feel emotion. As designers managing supermassive groups where we have lots and lots and lots of particles, 10,000, 5,000, what have you, we can use this to reinforce our emotional message. But again, turns out we're not special. My childhood friend, Frank Lloyd Wright over here, called this compress and release, where sequential spaces are designed with contrastingly low ceilings and tall ceilings, and narrow walls and wide walls to highlight sensations of tension and freedom. This picture of this atrium, I think, does a really good job, where you have this tall atrium preceded by this low overhang. It's a technique we all probably use as level designers, but again, once you have this many players together acting as these individual gas particles, the effect can be quite powerful. Feeling uncomfortably close and then liberated and distant became a central motif in songs like All Is Soft Inside with the jellyfish and Warrior with the mantas that we saw. It was so powerful, in fact, we used it in the finale, Queendom. So take a look at this video and notice how everyone gets compressed and then released. There we go. It like never gets old. It's so fun. Okay, and that is that you don't know what a plasma is, and neither do I. Aspects of it will always be beyond the realm of our understanding. So thank you, Unfordance, for informing us about all of these different aspects, but also giving us a way to combat them. So now that we have this, we understand scale, we've got simplicity and spectacle and all of these things in our head, what can we do to make our lives easier as designers? Well, good thing we have our friend Tooling here with the magical, amazing mustache, the enviable mustache of Tooling. Only has one point for us, which is that simulation tools are a must-have. Allow me to explain. We discovered very quickly in the design process that we needed a way to visualize this on demand in various contexts. If we had 10,000 mantas in a really small space, that could compromise a lot of things: noise, performance, experience, emotion. Human behavior is hard to simulate, but our engineering team did create this tool called Follow Guys that allows us to spawn any number of players of any model at any radius around us with any shout frequency that would follow us as we move. We use this constantly throughout the development, especially when spot testing suspicious areas. Like, what's the worst case scenario like? Let's say 10,000 players manage to organize themselves and shove each other into like one concentrated area. What might that look like? I truthfully can't conceptualize a project at this scale without such a tool. As our needs grew, so did the tool itself, and I am eternally grateful for all the great engineers who helped build this and expand this. And yes, it never gets old just to see what it would have looked like if everybody was a little fishy watching the concert instead. So thank you, Tooling, and your wise mustache. Simulation tools are a must-have, I understand. But, as we mentioned, even the best tools can't simulate one thing, and that is sociality. Sky is a social game, after all. Sociality also happens to have the best analogies. We're going to get into these right now. So from the very beginning, we knew that to appreciate the humanity of such supermassive group sizes, players need to feel the loneliness of being all alone. You'll quickly lose appreciation for even the most delicious chocolate cake in the world if that's all you have to eat for every meal. Because we wanted to centralize that appreciation for humanity, our core arc, which we saw earlier, takes this chocolate cake approach, where it doesn't always force you to eat the chocolate cake, and likewise, doesn't always force you to be surrounded by 10,000 players. Instead, the story revolves around building up, breaking down, and then reviving the group, the number of players. And in this way, we can think of the player population in a supermassive group as an allegory for the player's emotion. So yes, while the stadium seats 10,000, and at various points along the way, you do experience the concert beside 10,000, we don't give you that luxury the entire time. We hold it away from you and use it as a tool to reinforce our emotional goals. So when you start, the first song of the concert is Exhale, Inhale, and you are all alone. You feel quite small. But we transition you to Runaway, and then you're beside 400. By the time that song reaches its climax, you're at 1,000. You start to feel very hopeful. But then, with All Is Soft Inside, the next song, we humble you back to 200, opening it up to 500 as the song reaches its climax. Now you're breaking free from your inhibitions. And in Warrior, we surround you with the full 10,000. You feel unbeatable together until you make your way to the seed, where your numbers start to drop and drop slowly until you are one fragile, solitary little butterfly flying through the darkness, until you eventually reunite with one other butterfly, and then you reunite with 500 others, and you make your way through space together, and you make your way back to the Colosseum. But this time, it's totally empty. Not even you are there. No one else is there either. Complete and total silence and absence. A single star descends from the sky, and here once again to emphatically celebrate the closing song, Queendom. The depth of your feeling of connectedness to the humanity around you is deepest when contrasted with the shallowness of your own solitude. You can call this a kind of emotional theory of social relativity. I've got analogies all day. They're going to keep coming. On a different note, your ability to connect to individuals and see yourself in relation to them is predicated largely on your ability to differentiate these individuals from each other. Homogeneity in any group is to be expected, but as Homo sapiens, we're all bipedal mammals with like flat fingernails, weird hair distribution, lanky arms and legs, But between us, we span a beautiful range of shapes, colors, sounds, movements, and yes, even smells. Now, imagine the last concert that you went to, and then imagine being surrounded by 1,000 Agent Smiths. That is not the experience that we wanted to create. So to combat this Agent Smith syndrome, we were able to do a couple things, like tint the model of these players, the abstracted players, with whatever color cape they would be wearing, scaling them with whatever height they had, and of course allowing them to emote with 4 different expressions. There's always room to improve, but remember, we're dealing with a supermassive group of 10,000 players being networked and sharing this space together. It really is an engineering marvel. We'll take what we can get. I think even this limited diversity helps nudge us out of that social uncanny valley where players can feel real but aren't totally real altogether. Thank you, Sociality, for your wonderful analogies with the emotional theory of social relativity, aka chocolate cake, aka distance makes the heart grow fonder, and the wonderfully named Agent Smith syndrome. I really appreciate you. But just because we've done all of that doesn't mean that everybody is aligned. That's what alignment is here for. 2 lessons here. 1 is to foster nearby solidarity with players, and 2 is to regularly regroup players throughout. It's one thing just to bring everyone together. It's another thing to align their experiences in one big shared narrative. Did you leave with an understanding that you all went on the same emotional journey together? Everything we've said already contributes to that, but some of the biggest factors, I think, actually emerged out of, surprise, surprise, technical and logistical concerns. 1, about where you would be seated to view the experience, and 2, how we would even synchronize the timing of all of this. These were chat benches and intermissions, and that's what we'll get to right now. So first, chat benches. This is a system that already exists in Sky. It allows up to 8 players to chat with each other if they're seated on the same bench, and it's used across the game to facilitate moments between friends and new players. Because you have to be seated at the bench, and because it allows you to chat with other players, and because it already supports 8 players, which was our standard room size, this quickly became the conduit for us to assemble the Coliseum, and this is how it contributed to alignment. When players join the concert, they're placed at a unique seat on a unique bench, which they are free to change until the concert starts. But once it starts, players all take their seats and begin their journeys together, a lot like the seats on a roller coaster. And yeah, we had a lot of amusement park conversations during the course of development here. These players, these benchmates, become your cohort. You chat with them during intermissions, you hype each other up, you share thoughts and feelings about the excitement of what is to come. And in them, you have a safe personal space. And that's important, especially when at any moment you could be surrounded by thousands upon thousands of players. It aligns your unique experience with just a handful of other players, and you can leave with specific memories you've made together. So that's what we did on the small scale. But how do we align everyone? That's where the intermissions came in. And again, the intermissions came from a concern, and that concern was, how do we reliably and synchronously transport all the players to all these different levels, given the wide range of mobile and non-mobile platforms we support? Load times could be nearly instantaneous, or they could be rather long. And at this scale, and with this many songs, and with this many transitions, the compounded error of those discrepancies would turn the concert into an absolute incoherent mess. So instead, we tied the transitions to a global clock and created a 1 to 2 minute buffer to account for those delays. We could have done with less time, but then we would have had awkwardly short pauses and breaks, so instead we leaned into them. And that seemed to work quite well. It allowed late players to join during these intermissions and, again, allowed you to recompose yourself with your group. By the way, we know that this global clock strategy works quite well because in a later event, Days of Color in 2023, we didn't approach it with this global clock strategy, and that was really difficult. We had a lot of synchronization issues. So basically, we got confirmation that what we did for Aurora worked well, so that was great. But in these intermissions, we could recalibrate everybody because Aurora would provide some narrative exposition to propel us forward. So even if players were distracted, everybody would get realigned here. Aurora acknowledged what had just previously happened in the last song, guide us in some group activity, let's all chant together, or what have you, and then introduce the next song. If you've ever been in like a really long meeting and then somebody at some point goes like, hold on guys, what is this meeting even about? And then everybody kind of figures it out together and we say, okay, and then we proceed. Aurora was basically managing 10,000 person meetings for us. So these actually wound up becoming super, super important. And unknowingly, one of these moments became a developer and fan favorite, myself included. During one intermission, Aurora now infamously says, it's okay, you can cry. And because one of the emotes is cry, the stadium slowly fills with thousands of tears. It happens at every performance, and it did so during opening night, and again was kind of unexpected for us. Aurora says a lot of things in the concert, but because this was such a genuine line, and we had a relevant emote, and everybody found themselves at that emotional context, it resulted in one of the most community-affirming moments of the entire experience. Everybody voluntarily and spontaneously crying together. If crying with 10,000 other people doesn't bring you all together and align you, I don't know what is. And yeah, we tracked them throughout the concert, and you can see those 4 big spikes are all those intermissions, all of the emoting that was happening there. Thank you, alignment. We have learned your lessons. We're almost there. I promised takeout, but instead I'm going to deliver 4 small lessons, kind of like takeout, just 4 little morsels, little bites. 1, as you increase the player population in a supermassive group, your player distribution will multiply and not blur. I thought that would be the case, but it turns out that if you have a hotspot with 10 people, you will have a raging inferno with 10,000. So be on the lookout for that. Takeout number 2, design for latency. You can try to design for everything being perfectly synchronized, but that's a fantasy land. Or you could live in reality and just accept the fact that things are going to come in at different times. Nothing in our experience fundamentally breaks if you experience it 5 or 10 seconds later than everyone else, even despite all of the work that we did to synchronize everyone. You can actually see here, Aurora's moving around pulling players in, and there's actually quite a long trail behind Aurora of everybody that comes in with their different latency. And this worked to our advantage, particularly during the big Aurora yeet that she does at the end of Queendom. I think this would have been far less compelling if it was just a uniform sphere just expanding outward. I don't think that would have been as great or filled with as much charm and character as this wonderful explosion here. I mean, it's great because of the latency. We're almost done. Takeout 3, synesthesia as a pulse. What is synesthesia? Synesthesia is just aligning the visuals that you're seeing with the audio that you hear. We're going to play a little sample so you can see. Thank you, Aurora. Okay, so I spent a lot of time with one of our talented engineers, Scott. Home videos we all might have probably seen. It might not seem like much, and I absolutely have no clear proof that the synesthesia does this, but I really do believe that it plays a key role in supplying like an underlying shared heartbeat among everybody who's participating. Lastly, playtesting supermassive groups is a huge challenge, and do not underestimate it. Imagine organizing a party for just a few friends, and then some neighbors, and then the whole block, and then the entire neighborhood, only to find out that you don't have enough cups for everybody. And then convincing them all to come again just so you can find out what the next problem is. Like maybe everybody crashes instantly, or maybe nobody can see anybody else, which are all real things that happen throughout the course of development. So I want to send a huge thanks to folks like Travis Shute, Denise Schlickburn, Amelia Rosina, and everyone from our beta community and our live community who showed up to these playtests. I already said we have the best community, but without you, these experiences would not have been possible. My advice to developers and designers is to playtest early and playtest across scales. 5 is different than 50, is different than 500, is different than 5,000, is different than 10,000. It just takes time to get there. Lastly, dessert. Why dessert? Because dessert is something small that you have after you've already eaten the main course. I'm just going to share one small thing we did for the encore, which happened after we had already created the concert a year later, which was minigames. So, because the intermissions work so well at aligning everybody, we wanted to do something before the concert started for the encore. We had a lot of these small, intimate activities that allowed you to share personal moments, but nothing that really activated the group as a whole, all 10,000 players. What we were really missing was our hype person to break the proverbial ice and prime everyone for embarking on a voyage together. So for the encore, we took all of those lessons and we created 4 unique mini games. There was the voting towers, which is the larger-than-life bar chart that players could physically enter into and vote and see, reflected in the data what they chose. The Great Spheres, which is, I still believe, should hold the world record for largest game of virtual soccer in the world, but we did not get that record. The Duel, which is a kind of tug-of-war, and the Light Parade, which is a self-explanatory parade. What they all have in common, in addition to being structured and simple, is that they keep fun. Here are some of the results from the voting towers. People's favorite songs, the shared features in Sky. We have a lot of introverts in Sky. Drawing is apparently the favored hobby over painting and sewing and sculpting. And this depicts, it's kind of hard to see, flow, flower, journey, and the big pink bar is Sky. So Sky players like Sky. That's reassuring. And my favorite, sleeping. Sleeping beats dancing, singing, and sitting even. So, in conclusion, thank you for going on this voyage with me. I hope you have a better understanding of what designing at supermassive groups entails and how all of these forces play a part in delivering a powerful shared experience. Supermassive group is a term I coined for this talk. We never referred to it in such a way during development because back then we had no conception of its scale or properties. Supermassive itself is just a compound word that means big, big. And I think that's what our mentality has to be, what our dreams and ambitions have to be, and what our faith in humanity has to be if we want to impact people, change their lives for the better, and help them all feel connected to the world around them. Even more so when we're designing at such record-breaking scale. Thank you very much, everyone.